For the price of a cup of coffee, join my Patreon. The page includes audio documentaries not available on my YouTube channel. Link below in the description. Thanks for watching. In November 1995, the Beatles anthology made its debut on American television. It detailed the rise of the Beatles, ending with their final album in 1970. George Harrison, as ever, had been completely honest throughout the interviews. Despite their disagreements, the three Beatles had enjoyed being part of the anthology. After a long day of interviews at George's home, they'd gone into the recording studio where they performed together in front of a camera for the first time since 1969. These tapes became known as the Friar Park recordings. Neil Aspinall later stated, "It's pretty much throwaway stuff. It was no big deal. It wasn't like an hour-long jam or anything. They just played a couple of minutes." The single Free as a Bird was highly anticipated and expected to shoot straight to number one. It didn't. Michael Jackson's Earth song held that position. The song had featured a month previously on the anthology CD, so many Beatles fans already had a copy of Free as a Bird by the time of the single release. Real Love fared even worse, mainly due to little to no airplay on Radio 1. They had chose to fill the playlist with bands such as Supergrass, the Bluetones and Oasis. Ironically, these groups were greatly inspired by the Beatles. The three Beatles were obviously disappointed. This was the first time their records had been sidelined. They hadn't worked as hard on Real Love anyway. Most of it was complete, and they credited that song to Lennon alone. It's the only Beatles song that lists Lennon as a sole songwriter. Anthology 1, the first CD of the trilogy, contained material from the Beatles' days as the Quarrymen right through to the For Sale sessions. The album cover was designed by Klaus Voormann, who'd previously drawn the Revolver cover. With the release of the first anthology package, Pete Best would finally benefit from his career in the Beatles. Side note, Pete Best's face was cropped out of the front cover. Pete later used the ripped out image for the front cover of his album Hayman's Green. At the time of filming, Pete Best got word of the anthology project. He later stated, "I knew anthology was coming out, but I didn't pay too much attention to it because I never figured they would include me on it." Pete ended up on 10 tracks of an overall 60. He had Paul to thank for this. Paul had insisted on using Pete Best's drums on the early recordings, knowing Pete would finally receive some Beatles money. Pete Best earned approximately $6 to $9 million in royalties. He was then able to quit his job as a civil servant. Side note, Stuart Sutcliffe would also have received royalties, but by this point he'd been buried in Hutton Parish Cemetery for over 30 years. For the anthology project, McCartney had taken a 4-year break. He resumed his career in 1997. EMI had also instructed McCartney not to release any material while the anthology CDs were hitting the charts. At first he felt insulted, but then figured it would be stupid to go up against himself, and also took comfort in the fact he didn't need to release anything in the meantime. His next album title was inspired by the story that featured in the anthology documentary about John Lennon claiming he came up with the name of the Beatles when he saw a vision of a man on a flaming pie. Paul titled the album Flaming Pie and joked he was the man on the pie that John saw. The album also featured George Martin, Jeff Lynne and Ringo Starr, the three men he'd worked on the anthology project, and Flaming Pie was recorded at around the same time. George Harrison, meanwhile, began work with Ravi Shankar on his album Chants of India. He can be seen in a VH1 television appearance with Shankar promoting it. This would also be his final appearance on TV. Not long afterwards, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He publicly blamed years of smoking for his illness. During the making of Anthology, Paul's wife Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer. The doctors told Paul they caught it too late and she had about 18 months to live. She passed away in 1998. Paul held a concert called Concert for Linda in her honour.
I just want to dedicate all of this to Linda, who's my beautiful baby.
While making the anthology, Ringo's ex-wife Maureen died from leukemia. Ringo and Maureen's 82-year-old mother were at her bedside when she died. McCartney wrote a song titled Little Widow about Maureen. It featured on Flaming Pie. During the making of Anthology, Yoko Ono was battling with Julian Lennon over money, or lack of money, left to him in his father's will. They reached a settlement in 1996, with Julian being paid an unspecified amount. The media speculated it was around 20 million. Julian denied it was. Ono has since stated the reason she was never able to get close to Julian was because it upset his relatives, possibly his mother Cynthia, to see them becoming friends. Ono stated, "He was very loyal to his mother. That was the first thing on his mind." On the 3rd of November 2023, the Beatles' third unfinished song Now and Then was released. A day later came the release of the official music video. It was met with glowing reviews. The Guardian even went as far as to say the song was better than Free as a Bird and Real Love. The majority of Beatles fans have really enjoyed and been moved by the bittersweet ballad. Though I have noticed some fans were unhappy that a middle section of the original demo was removed. At first listen I didn't think too much, but the song definitely grows on you. But more from an emotional point of view, it's a very sentimental song. 43 years after John Lennon's death, his final song has still made a big impact, and just reading the replies on my recent video, I can see it's moved so many people. I can't help but wonder what impact the Beatles' music will have in another 43 years. At the time of making this documentary, Now and Then is hit number 1. I for one hope it gives the Beatles their final Christmas number 1.